Now let's get on to the sermon. This week is Rosh Hashanah. We call it the Feast of Trumpets. It's one of 7 biblical or biblically mandated, we call them feasts, but it really should be something like holy season. And you'll remember this chart that I actually handed this out a year ago or so, and I've shown it a couple times. This explains the different feasts and how they relate to the coming of Christ, both his first coming and his second coming. And the period between the feasts is considered the church age. Now this right here is a little bit hard to read from there, and there's a lot of verses there. If you want, I can get some more printed up for you, but I don't have any right now. And this is a little bit simpler version of it. It doesn't have all the verses and stuff, but it kind of gives you a broad picture of what's going on. The first feast, over to the left, is what we call Passover. We know that Passover is when Jesus was crucified. That it was Passover week when he was crucified. And then during Passover week, you also have the celebration of first fruits. What is first fruits? That's the first harvest. The first grains are being harvested. This is typically even barley. Not even wheat has come in yet. But they take a portion of that and you give that to God. And that's where the priests actually got some of their food, was from this first fruits, the first harvest of the year. Then the next thing is unleavened bread. Unleavened bread. What is unleavened bread? That's bread made without yeast. You see, in this scenario, in this picture, yeast is compared to sin, and they cleaned that out. And when this was instituted, they even made certain days special to prepare for this. They had certain days that they would go in, and they would completely wipe out their supplies of yeast. Anything that is made to ferment and rise bread, taken out, gotten rid of, which means after this, they would have to start over. Think about that. How do we start over when we want to make new bread with yeast? We go down to the grocery store and buy a little packet, don't we? You reckon they ran down to Kroger and got a little packet? No, they don't have such a thing. They had to depend upon God to re-provide that yeast, natural, wild yeast. And that's why their breads are different than our breads, is because we have different yeast. We have different ways of doing things today. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread is observed during the week of Passover, and that's why we know that the bread in communion, what we call communion, should be unleavened bread. It should not have any yeast in it, because if it had yeast in it, it wouldn't have been at that Passover meal where Jesus instituted what we call communion. After the unleavened bread, Shavuot comes. Some call it, well, we call it Pentecost, but some call it Festival of Weeks. Why do you call it the Festival of Weeks? Because it's 7 weeks after Passover. So they call it the Festival of Weeks, and that ties it all together. What do we know Pentecost as? We know Pentecost as when Jesus sent the Holy Spirit to the Christians. That is what we consider the start of the church. So that's how we get to this point right here, that harvest. It's a 4-month period where there's no Jewish celebrations during that 4 months. They are actively working in their fields. They're growing things. They're getting ready for the fall harvest. The fall harvest. What's going to happen there? Well, in the fall, you have your first feast, first holy season is called Yom Teruah. We call it the Feast of Trumpets. Really, it should be called a holy season, although God instituted it on one day. We read that in the opening verse where he instituted it as the first day of the 7th month. You can say, well, preacher, we're already into the 9th month, and this year it'll be the 10th month when this happened. No, you see, it's on the Jewish calendar, on the Hebrew calendar. And in the Hebrew calendar, they don't start until Passover. Passover is when their fiscal year begins, shall we say. By the way, the Jews have 4 different dates that they call a new year. We do one, January 1. They have 4. The first is Passover. And I don't know the other 2, but one of the others is Feast of Trumpets. Happens on the first day of the 7th month of their calendar. And in modern times, they have spread that over 2 days. This year, it's Tishrei 1 and 2. For us, this year, it'll be October 2nd and 3rd. Now, why do they celebrate it over 2 days like that? Because they were dispersed across the world, right? So there are Jewish people all around the world where it takes a 24-hour period. And they had to be very specific on when this started. Remember, their day starts at 6 o'clock the day before our day. In other words, tonight, Sunday night at 6 o'clock becomes their Monday. That's the way to look at that. And they had to determine these days because they didn't have watches and calendars hanging on the wall. They had to determine these things by the moon. And when you could see the first little sliver of the moon, you knew that that was the end of the new moon period, or that was the new moon. And then you could celebrate this day. Well, the people over in China are going to see that at a different time than the people in Jerusalem, just like the people in Jerusalem are going to see it at a different time than we do here in the United States. So that's why now they take a 2-day celebration for this, quote, festival, this holy season. And then comes Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, what we call the Day of Atonement. We call it when Jesus finally saves the people from their sins. But we're not real clear on our definition because we don't truly understand what the Day of Atonement is. The Day of Atonement is the one day in the year when the Holy of Holies can be entered by the priest, by the high priest. Once a year, one man chosen by lot. They didn't know who was going to be the high priest chosen to go in the next year. They chose that by lot. When John the Baptist's birth was announced, that scene happened on this day, and his father Zechariah had his mouth closed because he didn't believe what the angel told him. Now, all that happened on this day. They were worried. He wasn't coming back out. He was taking too long in there. He was only supposed to be in there a certain amount of time, but the angel was in there talking to him and conversing and taking more time than it took to do his regular work in there. That was Yom Kippur. That's still celebrated every year. And then the last festival, holy season, is Hag HaSukkot, or we call it Tabernacles, Feast of Tabernacles. What is the Feast of Tabernacles? They were commanded to build temporary shelters. Those temporary shelters were to remind the Israelites that their time between leaving Egypt and being allowed to come into the promised land, that they were in temporary shelters. And God even had a temporary shelter for himself. We called it the tabernacle. What does tabernacle mean? It means a tent. It's a place to dwell in a temporary structure. So now, all around the world, the Jews build temporary structures They cannot have a solid roof. They do not have a solid roof. The one that our neighbors here at the Jewish Center build doesn't have solid walls. Some actually put up solid walls in other parts of the world. But these guys use open air concept, and those who are very strict in their beliefs, they actually still use the structures that week. The men are required to eat all their meals in those structures. They can sleep in there. They should be even sleeping in there. That's supposed to be their home for that week. These guys don't practice that in this one. I don't know what they do at their own homes. But this one is not occupied. I've watched. I contemplated going over there and eating a meal myself, but I didn't want to offend nobody, so I didn't. That is the representation of what we call the millennial kingdom. Because you see, we will be told, those living on the earth will be, at that time, will be living totally independent on God. The world will have gone through major destruction through the 7-year tribulation, and then Jesus will be physically here on this earth, reigning and providing all the needs for all people here on this earth. Now, this by the way, this chart comes from Arnold Fruchtenbaum. He is a leading scholar on Hebrew and Old Testament studies, and he has many books. This comes right out of his book called The Feast and Fast of Israel. This happens to be on page 32. But each one of the feasts, Passover is Messiah's death. First fruits is the resurrection. Paul even calls Jesus the first fruits of the resurrection. What is the resurrection? That's the body being transformed from the physical state that we know into the state that Jesus' body was at his resurrection. Then the unleavened bread represents the offering of the sinless blood, which we know that was Jesus. Then the birth of the church is represented by Pentecost. It happened on Pentecost. The Jews were celebrating Pentecost when the church received the Holy Spirit. Then the rapture of the church, when we are taken out of this earth and we receive new bodies as a body of believers, that is the Feast of Trumpets. And then the tribulation is the 7 years. That's represented by Yom Kippur. That's where what does it mean to be atoned? It means to be cleansed. Well, the 7-year tribulation is a cleansing of the earth. We went through that in Revelation as we went through that. That's the time of cleansing this earth. It's going to take 7 years. And at the end of that, after that is the 1,000-year reign of Christ, represented by the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, there are different names for this holy season that's coming up, because it is the next one physically on the calendar. We know it as the Feast of Trumpets. That is an English adaptation of what is happening. The Jews do not call it a Feast of Trumpets. They have other names that they use. They call it, their primary word is Rosh Hashanah. It means head of the year. And this phrase is never applied to this holy season in Scripture, although it is used in Ezekiel 40, chapter 40, verse 1. It's used there, but it's not in connection with what is now known as Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. It doesn't apply there, but that's where they get the words, and then it's been applied by the Jews to mean head of the year. Remember what I said, there are 4 different Jewish New Years, and this happens to be one of them. And for the Christian, it really will be the head of a new age, a new time in our life when Jesus takes the church. Yom HaZikaron. I guess I said that right. I do not know Hebrew that well, but that's as close as I can get. It means a day of remembrance. The Jews actually use this word, this phrase. a day of remembrance. This is not a scriptural name either. So now we've got the Feast of Trumpets, which isn't scriptural. We got two more Hebrew words that the Bible doesn't use for these days. And then we have another one, Yom Hadin. Yom Hadin. It means the day of judgment. The day of judgment is Christ taking the church out of the world, a type of judgment? Absolutely. He decides on that day who is following Christ, who is following what the scriptures say, what they mean. Yeah, only those are the ones that will be involved in the rapture. Again, another non-scriptural name. Why do I present these non-scriptural names? Because one, they're being used. These are familiar terms in the Jewish circles. The Rosh Hashanah is familiar even in Christian circles. Yet none of them are biblical. They all describe what's going on. The Christians didn't come up with these names. The Jews did. So the Jews have come up with what is being said here, but they don't understand it completely. Now this one, Zacharon Teruah, that means a memorial of the blowing, a secondary biblical name. We find that in Leviticus 23:24, and we also see this term used in Job 38:7, and there it means shouting for joy. So, making noise. Making noise. Isn't it funny that this Hebrew term right here talks about shouting, same word, and also talks about a blowing. And what did the Hebrews blow? They blowed what is called a shofar. And we'll talk about the shofar a little bit more. But this same Hebrew word means two different things. Where do you reckon Paul might have got the idea when he describes to the Corinthians about there being a shout and the blast of a horn? Where did he get that idea? Maybe he got it from the Old Testament. You see, Paul would have known the Old Testament. He could quote the Old Testament from Genesis through whatever they have the last book as. I forget what their Old Testament's not in the same order as ours. We have Malachi, but I think theirs is different. Then the primary biblical name for this is Yom Teruah, which was on the chart. It means a day of blowing. And this is the primary biblical name for this season. This blowing. They have a prescribed number of times that they blow the shofar. We say trumpet, but it's really shofar. They blow this thing, and it ends up being 100 times in one day. So there are 100 blasts on that shofar. Is there something to that when Paul says, the last trump shall sound? I don't know. But it sure fits, doesn't it? There is a last blast on that shofar that the Jews look forward to. It completes their season of celebration. For the church, that will mean a beginning of a new season. Now, biblical observances, I explained this earlier. Originally, when God first instituted this, it was the first day of the 7th month. Tishrei, the month Tishrei. They have morphed that into 2 different days, and I explained that the reason they have done that is simply to accommodate the Jews around the world. What I find funny, though, is most of the Jews, with the exception of this country, most of the Jews have left all the other countries. They're back in Israel. I read something this morning that says that there are now more Jewish people living in the land of Israel than there have ever been at any time on earth. That's amazing. That's amazing. And there's about as many here in the United States as there are in Israel. So Israel could very quickly double their population if the Jews all went home. We, as this country, would be in a hurt if all the Jews went home to Israel. We really would. Now, I didn't know this before this morning, but who in this town is providing CPR training right after someone asks about it online? They'd already had that plan. I'm telling you, the Jews do a lot. The Jews do a lot in this country. They're very powerful. Many people get jealous of them. That's why we have anti-Semitism in this world. Because they hate the Jewish people. They hate that God has blessed them. You know that over 90% of all diamonds are cut in one country? 90% of all diamonds are cut in one country. That's Israel. There's a very good chance that if you have a diamond in jewelry, it went through Israel. Very good possibility. And you know, diamonds are one of the toughest things in the world to cut and cut right. Very hard substance. Very difficult to make those things have those nice, smooth, perfect cuts. One wrong move and you destroy the whole diamond. It shatters because you cut it wrong. It just goes wrong. You have to study the thing a long time before you cut it. Then you have to have your instruments set properly. And they have developed those techniques, and God has allowed them to do that. Why not America? Aren't we supposed to be the greatest country? Don't we have the most technology? We have someone else build all our technology now. It is a day of rest. This is a confusing one to a lot of people. Well, I thought the day of rest was supposed to be on Saturday. Yeah. Or for the Christian, it's supposed to be on Sunday. Yeah, Find me in the Bible where it commands a day of rest on Sunday. You're not going to find it. It's not there. You see, there are multiple Sabbaths. What does Sabbath mean? It's a time of rest. There are multiple Sabbaths. There are the weekly Sabbath, which is Saturday for the Jewish person. But then there are also other holy days that become a day of rest. My question is if he also commands sacrifices, it's a day of special sacrifices and not normal sacrifices that are scheduled on the regular basis. Those working the sacrifices, are they not working? Those taking care of the sacrifices? I'm going to tell you right now, it's a lot of work to cut up an animal. It's a lot of work. Any hunter that's done it himself knows how much work it is. From the time of the slaughter of the animal to the time it is put on your plate is a lot of work. A lot of work. And how are those people doing that supposed to be a day of rest? I don't know. I don't have an answer for you on that. But it's a commandment from God. It's a commandment from God. You read the Old Testament yourself, you can see it. This day is celebrated by blowing trumpets. We call them trumpets, but specifically the shofar. Now, the shofar, what is the shofar? The shofar is a ram's horn. What is a ram? It's a male sheep or something similar. They even use ibex horns. We don't consider the ibex as as a sheep, but their males are rams. And different shaped horns will make different sounds, just like the brass ones that we're familiar with. Everybody knows there's a saxophone and a trumpet and a trombone and French horn and all kinds of horns. They're all different shapes, aren't they? Well, where do you reckon they got the idea of coming up with different shapes? because the original, quote, trumpets were horns, actual horns from animals. Now, we have animals in this country that have what we call horns, but deers don't have horns. I'm sorry, folks. We say, how big was its horns? No, he don't have any horns. He got what's called antlers. Antlers are a solid bone material once they are mature. You cannot take the headgear off of a male white-tailed deer and make a trumpet out of it. You just can't do it. It's not possible. When you cut a ram's horn off, it's hollow inside, or there's fleshy material inside that will dry out and come out real easy. But it's circular. It's open inside. And even a cow's horns can be like that. But cow's horns weren't used. It was either the sheep or the ibex, because they were rams. A ram's horn. We don't call a male cow a ram, do we? We call it a bull. So the shofar were very specific horns from animals, and they are given special instructions on how to blow them. Now, the Bible does not lay out all of them. That has been added by Jewish writings throughout the years. A series of legends that have come out of the Jewish writings. There's multiple Jewish writings that we as Christians don't study. But if we did, we could learn something, because this is one of the things that happens. They think the creation of the world may have coincided with Rosh Hashanah. Now, how they come up with that, I don't know. But that's what they teach. I want you to follow along with the ones that you're writing in your bulletin. They also think the fall of man coincides with Yom Teruah, Feast of Trumpets. The fall of man. So that means that man, if this is true, man would have fallen either 1 year or 2 years or 3 years after he was created. My bet is if this were true, that it would have been 1 year, or the 7th month of that year, however you want to look at it. And the reason I say that is because they didn't have any babies before the fall. No babies before the fall of man. They also believe the birth of Cain and Abel happened on this day. And they also teach that each one of those had a twin sister. Now, there's no verse that states that Cain and Abel had twin sisters. However, we do know that Cain got a wife from somewhere, didn't he? We know that, don't we? That's a big mystery that everybody always asks. And well, this would explain it. If all the initial births were twins, you would have enough females for all the males. And then one of the males got taken out very early. So now there's even an extra. And even today, there are more women than there are men in this world. So, it's legend, but it has some biblical backing in some way. The next legend is that Cain and Abel's offering happened on this day, and that's when Cain went and killed Abel. Again, this is all legend, but we're gonna put all this together here in just a minute. The flood drying up. When Moses was able to come out of the ark, the ark landed on dry land. They believe all that water receded on that day, and that's what happened. Then they believe that the birth and the death of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all happened on this particular day. Now, if that's the case, one, I want to know how they know that. And two, why would they even think that? What makes them believe that? Well, you got to remember, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are considered the fathers of Israel. Abraham, Father Abraham. There's a song even that says Father Abraham, doesn't it? Well, Abraham is considered the father because he's the one that received the covenant. What covenant? They call it the Abrahamic covenant, that he would be the father of a great nation. How many sons did he have? Is that a great nation? No. Isaac, one of his sons. Really, his only son in God's eyes. God called him his only son. Disregarded Ishmael. Why did disregard Ishmael? Because Ishmael was not part of the plan. He wasn't part of the holy union between Abraham and Sarah. So God disregards him. Not totally, because Ishmael was made the father of a great nation also. However, that's not God's people. God called Isaac. And who is Isaac? Isaac is Jacob's father. Isaac wasn't the father of a great nation, was he? Then Jacob. Jacob got a new name, didn't he? Do you know that new name? Israel. Israel. That's the key. Israel. Now you have a great nation. Another legend, the binding of Isaac. Then Jacob arriving in Bethel. We don't remember that story too much, but that happened. They believe it happened on Feast of Trumpets. They believe that Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah conceived on this day. Conceived on this day. Then Hannah gave birth to Samuel on this day. We don't remember Hannah so much, but that's Samuel's mama. That's Samuel's mama. Samuel, big time in the Old Testament. Joseph being released from prison. Now, we remember that story, don't we? That, they believe, happened on the Feast of Trumpets. None of these have much support biblically, but the Jews teach this. Israel's slavery ending. Now we're coming back full circle, aren't we? Because that's when Passover began. The Feast of Trumpets in Scriptures. Leviticus 23, verses 23 through 25. Those are all on your bulletins. You don't have to write anything down, but they're there for you to look up this afternoon. Numbers 29, 1 through 6. We don't have time to read these. Psalms 81, 3 and 4. This doesn't say Feast of Trumpets right there in that, but it is definitely referencing it. Ezra 3, 1 through 6. Again, all of these are in your bulletin. And Nehemiah 8 through 12. So the Feast of Trumpets is all through the Old Testament. The dates for Tishrei 1 and 2 happen over the next few years. This year, in October. That's this week. This year, Tishrei 1 is October the 2nd. That SS stands for sunset. Sunset. Remember what I said? Their next day begins at 6 o'clock on the day before on our days. So Wednesday, October the 2nd at 6 o'clock becomes Tishrei 1 in Israel. And they will celebrate for 2 days. Granted, it looks like 3 there, but that's because of the day before at the beginning. That NF stands at nightfall. October 5th at nightfall. Next year, it's September 22nd through 24th. The next year, September 11 through 13. In 27, it'll be October 1 and 2, back to similar like this year. Then in 28, it'll be September 20th through the 22nd, very similar to 25. And then the year 2029 for us, it'll happen on Stephanie's birthday and run through September the 11th. This year it's on a Wednesday. Next year it's on a Monday. The next year it's on a Friday. It changes because our calendars don't match up. The next year it happens on a Friday again. Look at that. Is that not strange? See, their calendar's different. They adjust. Then it's on a Wednesday again. And then on a Sunday. Their calendars are different. It's very difficult to figure all these things out. But people have done it, and it's easy to find online, but it's hard to comprehend.